Why buy miniatures when you can make your own? Welcome back to Envelope Do Miniatures. My name is Deets, and yes, as you all know, I'm a massive simp for Warhammer. It's basically what this channel is all about. And you may be surprised to hear this, but it's more than just a nostalgia for me. It actually comes down to the sculpt and artistry behind these old miniatures. Sure, collecting and painting old miniatures is fun, but for me, I really love to see the kookiness and the artistry that's gone into these miniatures as well. In my opinion, each mini is made by an artist, and you can see the skill and dedication that's gone into each one. Now, I was walking around my local craft shop the other day and stumbled across the clay section, if that's what you want to call it, and it had me thinking, why don't I make my own miniatures? They can't be that hard to make, can they? Well, spoiler, they're actually extremely hard to make. They're that hard to make that I was actually thinking about canning this video and not posting it, but then again, whatever, I thought I'd show you guys my process and what I was going to create anyway. Now, as I said a few months ago, that this is going to be the year of the Dwarf for me. So once I had my clay, I was thinking what miniatures did I want to create, and I thought that Dwarfs would be the best one. They look pretty simple, they've got a big hat, big beard that covers the body, so they really shouldn't be that hard. And oh boy, was I wrong. And just an FYI, I've never sculpted before. I think the last time I did anything like this was in primary school when I made a face out of clay, so I have no experience in this, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. It's really just a learning process. I'm literally just going to wing this, and I didn't even know if the brand of clay I had was good, so if you know anything about sculpting or what clays to use or what materials to use, make sure you put a comment down below to help us all out. All right, let's get sculpting. And the equipment I'm using for this is a cheap sculpting kit, wire, alfoil, toothpicks for sculpting details, and the clay. I also used some wet fine sandpaper. Now, once I had all my gear ready, it was time to get creating this chubby little fella. I wanted him to be in the 28mm scale range, so I used this GW Chaos Dwarf for scale, and I drew down his total height and where his head came up to on a bit of paper. You'll notice later that this was a bit of a waste of time, and the scale of this dude really blew out. Then, using some alfoil, I rolled up a tiny ball and tried to shape his body to be the same size. Now, mistake number one here, I made this ball way too big. I made it roughly the same size as the example mini's body. I should have made it a little bit smaller, as I'd be slapping clay over this, so the size would definitely be getting bigger. I trimmed some wire to be the same size as this guy's hat. I did this to create a little frame for the clay to stick onto. I then trimmed off some more wire and wrapped it around the alfoil to position where I wanted his arms. The wire I used was a little bit stubborn, but it did the job nicely. Now, as I said earlier, I don't know if this brand of clay is any good, so if you are a sculpting guru, let us know down in the comments, or let us know what you would use. This clay came in a few different colors, but I chose gray because if I wanted to paint it later on, it'd be a pretty neutral color. The clay was pretty stiff when I got it out of the packet, and I'm guessing that's because it's been on the shelf for so long, but a good knead sorted this out, and it became way more easier to use. I rolled out a thin sheet of clay and then slapped this over the alfoil ball, making sure it covered completely, and then I just smoothed it over with my fingers. Now, one thing I learned as I was going on this little project was that balls and sausages are a sculptor's best friend. I use these shapes kind of as a starting point for each parts of the body and just build from there. I want to get started with the face and the head first. I made a few little balls all the same size and placed one down on the shoulder and then one on the face, and then I started having a play around building the face by pinching in a little bit of a nose and then using the tool to flatten out sections. Putting the nose down first was a good way to find the center point of the head. I then trimmed up another little sausage and placed it under the nose to create a curly little moustache. And using sculpting tools, I just prodded and poked it until I had a nice shape. Then it was time to put down another sausage for the nose, and I made sure this went over the moustache, and then I started blending it in. From here, I added an eyebrow line, and then I started pushing around the clay a little bit just to get the face shape looking a little better. Next up, I wanted to make the hat, but as you'll see, this is kind of like a trial and error approach to this whole thing, so you'll probably see me go back and fix things up later. Things I didn't always work the first time. I rolled a thicker clay sausage, chopped it to length, and then added some trim, and then I slid it on top with a little bit of wire, making sure it was firmly in place and it didn't really move anywhere. I then made a heap of sausages for the beard and just stuck them all on one by one, and I also made a little arm which I stabbed on the wire. Just an FYI, I will do these steps again, but it was nice to kind of see the mini take shape and the outline of this little dude come to life. Now for the part that I was worried about the most, that was creating the face. I really feel like this was the make or break part of this miniature. I made some little eye bags and then placed them above the moustache to where I thought they would sit. I also placed some little balls for the eyes above this, and then another little sausage just above to kind of make an eye socket area, and then I got sculpting. One thing you'll notice is that this clay was extremely soft, and everywhere I placed my fingers would show a little mark, or if I pushed too hard, I'd kind of lose the shape. The beard was basically ruined, but that's okay because it's only clay and it can be fixed. Now after about an hour of playing around with the clay, it started to click to me on how hard I should push some areas and what tools work better for certain spots. I knew the face was the main focus of this mini, so I made sure I gave him all the Dwarf details like a big nose, little tusks, bushy brows, and a prominent, beautiful, strong moustache because moustaches are number one. As you can probably tell, I destroyed the beard from handling it too much, so it's time for round 2. Again, I made some thicker sausages and placed each one on using my sculpting tool, and I made sure I pushed them under the lip and underneath the moustache. I never thought my snips would come in handy for this, but they were actually great in trimming away the little bits of clay that were too long. Once I was happy, I then poked in some lines for the hair and some texture, and I also poked in some little holes at the bottom just like Dwarfs have on their beards. Now I was pretty happy with how this guy was traveling, and it was time to move on to the body. But before we get into that, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe if you want to keep up to date with all my latest videos. I'd really appreciate it. Time to make some chubby dwarf hands, and I flattened out a little ball and then carefully marked out some finger lines, making sure the fingers were all roughly the same size. Once I was happy with this, I then stuck this bad boy firmly on and just pressed it into place. Next was another part of the mini I had no idea on how to create, and that was the scale mail armor. I'm guessing the GW sculptors back in the day had some sort of impression they used to imprint this pattern, but I had nothing like that, so I just decided to make tiny little balls, put them side by side, and then squish them down. I realized that starting at the bottom of the arm was pretty important so they would overlap each other in the correct way. Dwarfs have these really cool little shoulder pads, and this guy wasn't going to miss out on having these. So I flattened and cut out a shoulder pad shape and then placed it over the shoulder. I then placed a flattened little sausage over the edges and pinched it together to give the shoulder pad some type of armor trim. I also made a little horn and slapped that on top of the shoulder pad. As this process went on, it kind of occurred to me how important it was to layer certain things and plan ahead. And what I mean by that is it's kind of important to do the things that will kind of sit under certain objects first. And I know that sounds like a really obvious thing, but when you're sculpting, it's kind of easy to go ahead and do the fun stuff first and really not plan and take your time with these sorts of things. I found myself doing that way too often. Now, after the hair was down, I thought it would be best to tackle that big old hat again, and this time make it much bigger. I flattened a large piece of clay and then cut a big rectangle out of it. Then I added another skinny long rectangle to it for some detail and trim. One thing every Dwarf Lord needs on his hat is a big old skull, and I thought I'd make this part super easy and carve it out of some flattened clay. Using a knife, I cut out the round shape and carved on some eye sockets, a nose hole, and edged out some teeth. I gave it a quick clean up and then threw it on the center of my big rectangle and added some horns. Now it's time to slap on the hat, and I did this by wrapping it around the head. You'll notice that I made some funky little arrows, but I took these off later because these would get in the way of my horns. I then gently prodded the hat and shaped it to where I wanted it, and then I added a little cap on top to seal it. As I said, I wanted some horns, so I wrapped some clay around some wire and then just pinned these on to the hat. At this point I added some feet to the mini, some fancy bits to the hat, and I also went around sculpting little bits and pieces here and there. But now it's time for the fun part, and it's time to create the axe. I had this spare pop rivet in my pocket from work, and it was the perfect height for my axe. Now it was a little thin, so I wrapped it and rolled it around in clay and then poked it onto a little ball. Then using my shaping knife, I free-handed an axe and then slowly and carefully cut it out using a flowing motion with my wrist. I removed some of the excess clay, and then I wanted to cut in some teeth to the axe to make it a little more mean looking. Finally, I wrapped the axe head around the pole. I also made a little hand and then stuck that onto the arm. Now in hindsight, the hand may have been a little bit too big and odd looking, but it's not really worth being too hard on myself as this was the first time I was doing it. After this, I went back over and added little bits and pieces like the opposite shoulder pad and more hair. I did feel like I played around a bit too much with the soft clay, and I lost a lot of the detail on the back. When the time came around to bake this bad boy, I did have to reshape it a bit before I put it in the oven. Now each polymer clay kind of has different guidelines and temperatures when baking, so make sure you look them up first before you get onto this step if you're doing this at home. Now I just chucked this guy in the oven at about 130 degrees Celsius for about an hour or an hour and 15 or something like that. He came out nice and hard, no cracks, and I was really worried that this was going to be the make or break time for this miniature. I thought it would just crumble in the oven, but it didn't, so I'm very, very happy about that. Now you could probably leave it here, but I had a lot of finger impressions and odd little shapes in this guy, so I wanted to give it a little sand to smooth. I used water and a drop of dishwashing liquid and dunked my sandpaper in and got sanding super gently. I used the dishwashing liquid so the clay that kind of came off would wipe away easier. Now this process took me about an hour to do, and I probably could spend some more time on it. If I'm gonna go paint this guy later on down the track, I probably will go back and sand him again and get rid of some of those lumpy bumps. Now as you can see, here is the finished mini, a little bit of dust on it here and there. And the question is, am I happy how it turned out? And yes, I am pretty happy how it turned out. There are a lot of things I would change and there are a lot of things I would do again, but I guess that's just the process of making these things. It's all trial and error. And I did have a lot of fun doing it. Now, one thing this little project taught me was how much appreciation I have for those old Hammer minis and those old hand sculpted miniatures. One thing I've been hearing lately a lot about the old world is how ugly the miniatures are and whatnot. And I don't really believe that's true. There's a lot of artistry that goes into these things. There's a lot of skill that goes into these things. And it's extremely hard and complex to make these miniatures look really, really good. So I really recommend, as a hobbyist, you should give this a try at home. What's the worst that can happen? It's just a little bit of fun, and you never know, you might make something that you really are proud of. Now, sculpting miniatures may seem like a bit of a slog, but I feel like it's a side of the hobby that we tend to forget about as well. In the future, I'd love to do some more sculpting and maybe even do it on the computer or something like that. But anyway, if you'd like to see me paint this guy, chuck a comment down below. And I want to say a big thank you to all my Patreons. You guys are a bunch of legends. Thank you so much for all your support. Anyway, guys, be kind to each other. I'll see you next time. Cheers.